Is Frank Castle really a raving madman? Or is there less to him than meets the eye?
I think you're a half measure. I think you're a man who can't finish the job.
Science-Man the Punisher. Frank Castle is a pretty interesting guy, to say the least. Known by his alias, the Punisher, Frank Castle was subject to many disturbing acts of violence before becoming his anti-hero self. In this video, we're going to explore those events and attempt to conclude something about the Punisher on a mental level. Many people would call the Punisher 100% insane. I mean, he has to be, right? He goes around killing people. Our morality is what separates us from animals. If Frank lacks that sense of morality, then there's gotta be something terribly wrong upstairs, right? Well, on the other hand, the Punisher only kills the bad guys. He is a protector of the innocent, however innocent or not he is himself. This is what makes Frank Castle so interesting. In school, they'll tell you that an anti-hero is someone who goes against the majority, but I don't think that's the case at all. Would you call Luke Skywalker an anti-hero? No, he's a hero because the majority he is up against is blatantly evil. To me, an anti-hero is someone with a heroic agenda and motive, but who conducts morally questionable actions to reach that agenda. The Punisher and Ghost Rider are great examples of anti-heroes. Heck, you could even say that the Avengers are anti-heroes, at least in Captain America Civil War. But let's get off that tangent. It's time for one of the bigger videos that we've done yet. Let's sit ourselves down and imagine we're a psychologist. But we're not just any psychologist. We're about to get a new patient. That patient is Frank Castle, aka the Punisher. And we're going to try and diagnose whatever is going on in Frank's head. We might just be in for a front row seat to one man's descent into madness. Patient profile, the Punisher. Since the Punisher's newest debut was in Daredevil Season 2, we're going to be using the events that take place in that continuity, although very similar events have been connected to the Punisher in comics and other media. So first, we need to take a look at Frank Castle's current state. Who is the Punisher? Frank Castle displays several types of behavior that may indicate some kind of mental instability. He's prone to violence, but it's not random outbursts. The violence is planned and directed towards specific individuals whom he targets. These targets are always criminals. Not once has the Punisher hurt an innocent, and there are even events in which the Punisher actively saved innocent lives. The only man who could be considered innocent that the Punisher has hurt is Daredevil. This is possibly because the Punisher sees Daredevil as someone who's on the same level as him, and therefore is not completely innocent. Or perhaps the Punisher sees Daredevil as a co-worker who just won't do his job. This is dependent entirely on whether or not the Punisher feels for his actions on a personal level or not. That's one of the big things that we now need to find out. So, a normal person doesn't do this, that's easy enough to say. Normal, stable people don't go out into the streets at night and mass murder criminals. By all means, the Punisher is a serial killer, even if the people he kills are guilty of terrible actions themselves. Like a serial killer, the Punisher does not show any guilt or remorse towards his actions. The only time he shows empathy itself is when he saves innocent people, and at one point when he connects with Daredevil in conversation. This, oddly enough, is very unlike a serial killer. More on that in a bit. We gotta get moving. Now that we know who we're dealing with, let's look deeper. There's gotta be a reason that he's unstable, whether it's a mental illness or not. What's the origin of this behavior? Why does he do it? Where did his desire to do it come from? Well, looking into his past, we have two big times in his life that could very well be the source of his violence and personality. The one most notable is the murder of his family. Frank Castle had 2 children and a wife, all of which were killed in the crossfire of a mob shootout. Frank Castle himself received a serious head injury but survived. That will come into play later on, but for now, we gotta focus on the origin. This, whether it led to insanity or not, is surely a part of the drive for Punisher's behavior. It's mentioned several times that he's attempting to find the ones who murdered his family and kill them. However, on the other hand, Frank Castle also experienced war firsthand. While we don't know precisely what happened to Frank while he served in Afghanistan, we know he was there and that he saw battle many times, as he was awarded the Navy Cross, which is second only to the Medal of Honor in the US military. So war is also a big part of his past, and war can often lead to mental disorders. So we have our 3 main factors: wartime, head injury, and the loss of his family. These are all pretty big causes of mental disorders and illnesses in the real world. But if that's the case, then what does the Punisher suffer from? We have about 4 main illnesses and conditions that could directly result from Castle's past, so we're going to go down the list just like that. Psychopathy. The majority of people would probably classify the Punisher as a psychopath, one who suffers from psychopathy. However, the definition of psychopath is often skewed nowadays, so we need to know the actual definitions and symptoms of psychopathy. A psychopath will display the majority or all of these behaviors. Psychopaths have a clear lack of empathy or remorse for their actions, and give no regard to the safety of other people. They do not see right from wrong, and therefore often harm others to get what they want. Another method of reaching their agendas is through manipulation. A psychopath can perfectly mimic a normal person, hold up relationships and friendships, but not really mean any of it. Right off the bat, it is clear to me that Frank Castle does, in fact, not display any clear signs of psychopathy. Castle does have empathy towards others. As for when he is relating to Daredevil in conversation, he knows how Daredevil feels about certain things. That's actually the definition of empathy, the ability to know what people are feeling and be able to relate to it with them. So although he does display a lack of remorse for his killings, he isn't emotionless. He doesn't need to mimic the feelings of a normal person because he legitimately has those feelings. Castle also clearly displays that, although it is a controversial one, he has an idea for himself about what's right and wrong, and who is okay to hurt and who isn't. He has displayed the ability and desire to protect innocent people, and would not wish to kill one of them himself. He knows right from wrong, even if it's a different view than our own sometimes. The only sign I can see that matches Frank is possibly manipulation, since he lied to get himself thrown in jail. However, he did this because he believed it would end up being for the greater good, leading to his release and regaining his ability to punish, if you will. And let's face it, all humans have lied about something at one point. It doesn't mean we're mentally ill. As far as I can see, the Punisher shows little to no signs of suffering from psychopathy. I think it's safe to say that he is far from a psychopath. Another word a lot of people jump to is sociopath. Now, there is debate on whether or not a sociopath and a psychopath are the same thing. I, for one, believe that there are distinct differences, but just keep in mind that there is debate around it. That being said, what separates a sociopath from a psychopath? Well, a sociopath displays most signs of a psychopath, save for one key feature. A psychopath could play it off as being a normal person, while this would likely be near impossible from a sociopath. Why? Well, because sociopaths display extremely emotional behavior, which is almost the opposite of a psychopath. They often experience outbursts of rage and emotion, whether that emotion is sadness, anger, or something else. Sociopaths are also very narcissistic, meaning they have huge egos. Frank Castle displays neither of these symptoms. Emotional outbursts are different from outbursts of violence. Frank uses violence as a battle strategy, not a vent for his emotions. As for his ego, quite frankly, my dear, he doesn't give a damn. Castle shows no signs of caring for his own safety or his own feelings, and he certainly does not think of himself as a higher human being. Oddly enough, the Punisher is a pretty humble and selfless guy. My conclusion is that the Punisher is not a sociopath. So, let's consider another, perhaps more obvious standpoint. It's been said that the Punisher may suffer from PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is a mental disorder that results from traumatic events. Many veterans of war develop PTSD, and let me tell you, it's a doozy on the patient. A lot can result from it, but there are a few main symptoms. Sufferers of PTSD will often be haunted by nightmares of whatever actions occurred that led to their PTSD. For instance, veterans suffering from PTSD will often have dreams that detail their wartime experiences, like bombs, shootouts, or killings. PTSD doesn't just result from war, however. It is quite possible that Frank Castle suffers nightmares that entail the killing of his family. The killing of Frank's family is likely where the PTSD would stem from, rather than his wartime. We don't know the details of his wartime, but we do know that Castle only began carrying out his attacks after the death of his family. This leans me more towards the idea of the murder giving Frank PTSD, although it could be argued that rather than the source, the killing could have been a trigger for his PTSD obtained from wartime. However you look at it, it's unlikely that the Punisher suffers from PTSD. While violence is a symptom of PTSD, Frank is well aware that he is committing it. One now famous line from the Punisher is when he gives Daredevil the choice of killing a criminal or killing Frank, and Daredevil asks him, "What kind of choice is that?" In response, Frank tells Daredevil, "The choice I make every time I pull the trigger." Most, if not all, sufferers of PTSD would not be fully aware of their actions, while it is clear that Frank knows what he's doing. However, these outbursts of violence aren't the only sign of PTSD that sufferers display. PTSD will often result in feelings of guilt, shame, and anxiety. These are all things that Frank, for the most part, does not display. It is quite possible that he feels guilt over not being able to save his family, but yet he feels no guilt for the countless deaths of others that he is responsible for. He feels no guilt in the killings, he feels no shame in his actions, and he is always pretty clear-headed, calm, and able to carry out his operations with great steadfastness. As far as I can tell, Castle shows no signs of suffering PTSD. Again, the small symptoms he does display are also considered normal for people who have suffered a tragedy in their lives. It doesn't mean it's a disorder. The last disorder that I can see causing Castle's behavior could be more physical than mental. Remember how I said Frank suffered a head injury the night his family was murdered? Head injuries have been shown to greatly affect personality. Take this real-life example, Phineas Gage. On September 14, 1848, Phineas Gage and other crew members of his were working on building a railroad. An accidental blast went off, and a large iron rod was driven straight through Gage's head. Miraculously, Gage survived with minimal damage to his body. However, the accident left Gage with a brain injury that changed his life forever. Once a reliable leader, regarded as the nicest guy on the team, Phineas became mean-spirited and unpredictable, very much unlike his former self. Phineas Gage had the iron rod break through his left frontal lobe, and if Frank Castle were to suffer a similar blow, it could be that the injury changed his personality, resulting in what I call a physical personality shift. However, I don't think this can be the case either. Gage and Castle's cases have one distinct difference. Gage never returned to his former self, while Castle often reminisced on times gone by and let some of his former self come out during talks with Daredevil and Karen Page. This suggests that there is no new or old Frank Castle. The Frank Castle we see is merely himself in a darker world than he used to reside in. So he's not a psychopath, he isn't a sociopath, he likely doesn't suffer from PTSD, and he hasn't undergone a physical personality shift. For those of you wondering, he's not psychotic either. A person suffering from psychosis would be experiencing mass hallucination, which Frank does not undergo. So, if the Punisher isn't suffering from any of these things, then what's ailing him? What makes him do the things he does? What makes him insane? Well, one thing we can say for sure is that Frank Castle either suffers from or has previously suffered from severe trauma. Trauma is one's emotional reaction to an extremely negative event. People who suffer from trauma are referred to as traumatized. There are a lot of reasons someone can become traumatized, but here are the most common reasons. Rape, domestic violence, natural disasters, severe illness or injury, the death of a loved one, or witnessing an act of violence. Well, we see here that Frank has suffered at least 2 of these, possibly even 3. He's witnessed acts of violence in both war and at home, he witnessed the death of his loved ones and the killing of his family, and it's possible that he's experienced severe illness during war. As for severe injury, that also goes along with the attack that claimed his family. Frank displays some pretty clear symptoms of trauma. The most common symptoms of trauma are things like reclusion, being more introverted than before the event, and not acting like your former self in general. While it's a bit vague, these are all symptoms that the Punisher displays, especially reclusion. When Daredevil tries to ask Castle about his past, Castle specifically tells him to stop pushing it.
You still go to mass?
Stop now, Red.
Stop.
Stop digging.
This is a clear sign of reclusion, as well as a suppression of emotions. However, there is one thing about trauma I haven't mentioned yet. It's not a mental illness or a disorder. While it's likely that the Punisher suffers from trauma until the end of Season 2, it doesn't make him insane. Any sane individual can experience trauma and become traumatized as a result. As far as I can tell, there aren't any other mental illnesses that fit the Punisher's criteria. My diagnosis? He's traumatized, yes, but he's sane. He isn't some guy who lost it over too much tragedy. He's someone who feels like he's found a higher meaning through the tragedy he's experienced. Instead of making him go insane, it seems like what the killing of his family did was make him step up to the plate that no one else would step up to. The sadness and guilt didn't drive him to madness, it drove him to make the choice he makes every time he pulls the trigger.